Hello philosophers, and welcome to our second real lecture. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about formal logic based off our reading in Philosophy Made Slightly Less Difficult. Now, formal logic might seem like a fairly dry subject. What usually interests students about philosophy is abstract thinking about the nature of truth, the reality, the good, that is, ethics, and so forth. Whereas logic it's more concrete. It's more similar to mathematics than what we typically think of as philosophy. And that's because both logic and mathematics are forms of deductive reasoning. Now, I'm sure at some point in your studies you've gone over the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning, but it might be helpful for me to give you a quick review right now. So, inductive reasoning is a form of reasoning that goes from particular observations to general conclusions. And so, you observe a number of particular white swans. And because all of your swans that you've observed have been white, you arrive at the general conclusion that all swans are white. But now let's say you come across a creature that in every way resembles a swan, except that it is black. Well, now you have a couple of options. Either you could say that based off your definition of a swan, this just isn't a swan because it's not white. However, it's often more useful just to recognize that our initial conclusion wasn't exactly right, and so it needs to be amended in order to incorporate this new data. And that's a hallmark of inductive reasoning, that it can always be falsified by new observations. And so this is why science is continually changing, it's continually growing, it's evolving as it collects new data. And so previously held conclusions are amended or at times even overthrown altogether in light of this new, stronger theory. At least that's how science should progress. Deductive reasoning, however, is meant to arrive at definitive conclusions. If you use deductive reasoning well, then your conclusion necessarily is true if your premises are true. Now that's an important caveat there, because logic actually isn't concerned if your premises, that is, if your kind of foundational constituents of your argument are true. It's only concerned about your reasoning process from your premises to your conclusion. And so let me give you an example of an argument that would be true if the premises were true. And so if I said, all creatures that live in the ocean are fish. All whales are creatures that live in the ocean, therefore all whales are fish. Now, if these premises are true, then this conclusion is absolutely true, and there's no disputing that. It is definitively true if the premises are true. Now, I'm sure you recognize that at least one of these premises is not true. That is, it is not true that all creatures that live in the ocean are fish. However, logic isn't concerned about that. Logic is only concerned about the reasoning process from your premises to your conclusion. And so if an argument employs a proper use of logic, it is considered to be logically valid. Now, if the premises are true and logic is properly employed, then we can say it is both logically valid and the argument is sound. And so in order for an argument to be sound, the premises have to be true and the logic has to be used validly. However, an argument can still be logically valid even if it's not sound. That is, even if at least one of the premises is incorrect. Okay, now deductive reasoning, it's highly formulaic. Again, because the premises themselves don't matter so much, we can talk about logical arguments in the form of variables. And so this is where it starts to look a little bit mathematical. Because when we're just looking at the structure of an argument, we can theoretically plug any variable, any particular premises into the argument. And so I think it'd be helpful to talk about some of the forms of argumentation provided in the text. So now we're dealing here with syllogisms, which are the most basic forms of logical argumentation. Now, in a syllogism, you have two premises followed by a conclusion that necessarily follows from the premises if the argument is valid. Now, there are a number of logical structures of syllogisms that we can use, and I'll upload some more examples to Blackboard. But for now, I'm just going to talk about the ones that are covered in the text. So they focus on conditional syllogisms, which are if-then arguments. And so if x, then y, x, therefore y. And so in a conditional syllogism, we're dealing with two variables. We've got the x and we've got the y. The x here is referred to as the antecedent. That is ante, that which comes before. And so it is the term we're starting with. This is the antecedent, and our y term would be the consequent, that which is the consequent of, that which follows from x. If x, then y. Now there are two logical forms of argument that can use this structure. And so the first one is referred to as modus ponens, which means something like the way that affirms. And so we're going to be affirming something to get to something else. And so in a modus ponens argument, we are affirming x in order to get to y. And I know I might be losing some of you just by talking about variables, but it actually is kind of common sense, right? And I think that'll be demonstrated if we plug in some premises into these variables. And so if it is raining, I will have an umbrella. It is raining. Therefore, I will have an umbrella. And so in a modus ponens argument, we are affirming the antecedent in order to affirm the consequent. Again, modus ponens, you're positing something, you're affirming something. If x, then y, x, therefore y. Now, there is a logical fallacy that we can commit here. That is an error, an invalid form of reasoning that we can commit. And that is, what would happen if we were to try to affirm the consequent? That is, if we said, if x, then y, y, therefore x. Think about this for a moment. Does this work? If it is raining, I will have an umbrella. I will have an umbrella, therefore it is raining. I mean, the conclusion there might be true. Maybe it is raining. However, notice I said maybe, whereas in order for an argument to be logically valid, it has to be definitively true that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. Now, by affirming the consequent, by saying I will have an umbrella, that does not necessarily indicate that it is raining, right? Maybe I have an umbrella for some other reason. Maybe I have a sensitivity to the sun, and so I need to carry an umbrella for that reason. And so when we try to affirm the consequent in order to affirm the antecedent, we are committing a logical fallacy referred to as affirming the consequent. Okay, now the other valid form of argument we can get from a conditional syllogism is referred to as modus tollens. That is that which negates, thinks tollens, take away. Might be a good way to remember that. And so in this form of argument, we are denying the antecedent in order to deny or negate the consequent. If x, then y, not y, therefore not x. If it is raining, I will have an umbrella. I do not have an umbrella, therefore it is not raining. See, this works, and it just makes sense if you think about it, because, well, I could have an umbrella for any number of reasons. We know from that first premise that one of those reasons it would be if it is raining. If it is raining, I will definitely have an umbrella. And because that isn't the case, then we know it's not raining. And so this actually works. If x, then y, not y, therefore not x. Now there's also a logical fallacy associated with this form of argument, and this would be referred to as denying the antecedent. That is, if we were to say if x, then y, not x, therefore not y, as I previously said, I could have an umbrella for any number of reasons, therefore we can't definitively say that the antecedent is not true just because, we can't definitively say that the consequent isn't true just because the antecedent isn't true. And so I have you work with this a little bit in your discussion board posts. I know that, again, as I'm kind of blathering on with all these variables and a little bit of Latin, it can seem more difficult than it is. But I think as you work with these in your discussion board posts and kind of look at and evaluate each other's, I think that it will make sense to you. Now, this is just a brief introduction to formal logic. There's a lot more to it, and as I said, a lot of times it might not seem like kind of the fun area of philosophy to study, but it's very important. And that's because truth is communicated through language. And apart from logic, language becomes gibberish, no matter how intelligible it may seem. In fact, think about the etymology, the origin behind the word logic. It comes from the Greek logos. And what does John tell us about the logos? En arche hen ho logos, kai ho logos hen prostantheon. In the beginning was the Word. John identifies Jesus Christ with the logos. Now, that does not mean that Christ is logic, but there is a connection between that, right? When John tells us that Christ is the logos, what he's saying is that Christ is that which gives order and uniformity and structure to all of existence. And apart from that structuring principle that is Christ, the world would descend back into chaos, back into the formless and the void. And so too, without logic, our words lose their meaning, our language loses its structure, and in turn, our minds themselves, and by extent the world around us, devolves into a formless chaos. And that's not something that we should revel in as Christians, right? We desire to have the mind of Christ, and we desire to have the world brought into proper order through the word that echoes through our words and our lives. And so logic matters, structure matters, intelligibility matters. And so I would encourage you, right, study logic. And even if you never study formal logic in any great depth, I would just encourage you, right, try to be logic, try to be structured in your thought, that you might be involved in the productive structuring of the world around you. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I look forward to seeing your discussion board post, and I hope you go in peace and go in wisdom.